you've said that you've been researching Lincoln and the Lincoln family for almost 30 years now, which is a very long time, probably judging by, how you look, probably the majority of your life. You don't seem like that old of a guy. So what, going back to the beginning, what inspired you to research the Lincoln family, and especially, because your specialty is Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, and Robert Lincoln, his son. So this is a more lesser known aspect of history that you sort of devoted yourself to. So just take me back to the beginning of this entire journey, and what was really the spark that ignited you to begin.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was 19 when I started. I was in college at the time, didn't want to be there. And a friend of mine saw on the walls of the college a thing called the Student Conservation Association, which still exists today. Um, and basically, what you did was you had to apply, get in to the SCA. You had to have references and applications and all this stuff. And then if you got in, then they give you a list of all 400 national parks, and you had to choose the four that you wanted to apply to. And it was just like a job; like there was no guarantee you'd get in. So I picked, of course, Alaska, Hawaii, Natural Bridges Monument in Utah, and I needed a fourth one. And so I'm looking through this list, and I've always loved history, so I thought, well, Lincoln's kind of cool. So I applied to the Abraham Lincoln Home in Springfield, Illinois, and of course they were the only one that wanted me. And actually, I was, I think, fourth on their list, but the other three all wanted to go to Yellowstone, so I got to go there, and I just I loved it. So I was a student volunteer, but I did all the same jobs that a ranger does. I just had a different title, basically. And I loved every minute of it. And so, and I was fascinated by Lincoln as well. So after that, I re-upped and I worked at Gettysburg. Then after that, I actually got into the National Park Service as a ranger, and I went back to Lincoln's Home as a winter seasonal. I also worked at the Arch in St. Louis. But really, my second time at Lincoln's Home is where I got into all this. So in college, I was a writing and literature major, and I've always been a writer. I love writing, but I've always loved history. And so, one day, for some reason I don't remember, I thought, I like to think I'm a pretty good writer, and I really love history. Maybe I should write about history. So when I worked at Lincoln's Home, I was a winter seasonal, and so I'd give tours of the house mostly, and in winter we'd have maybe one a day. So basically, for 7 out of those 8 hours a day, I would be sitting in Mr. Lincoln's home by myself, reading books all about his life. Or after I'd been there for a few months, I would go into the office there for the Rangers and do some research until I got called over to give a tour. And so it was while I was there that I wrote my first couple of articles about Abraham Lincoln. And then, once I started, I never stopped. But very quickly I learned that I prefer, as you mentioned, I prefer to write about things that are not written about ad nauseum. So, you know, I write about Abraham Lincoln, but I do articles. I've done one book. It was about his invention and patent, which had never had a book done about it. And so when I discovered Robert Lincoln and Mary Lincoln and how little has been written about them, and on Mary Lincoln, how so much of what's been written about her is wrong for a couple of different reasons. That's why I focused on them rather than Abraham. But also by learning about his family, you can't understand a person if you don't understand their family. So that also helps us understand Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, his family's probably a massive impact on his life, on the way he governed. But going back, I mean, to your days as a park ranger giving these tours, that sounds like such kind of a surreal and incredible experience to be alone in. Is this Lincoln's boyhood home where he was born?
No, this is the house he lived in as an adult in Springfield, Illinois.
So you're in his house alone, reading these books about his life, immersing himself in who he was as a person. What's sort of the metaphysical feeling that you have in those moments? I mean, can you, cuz I've been to I've been to a couple houses of, famous figures. I went to the Arlington house. Um where Robert E. Lee lived, and that was obviously really cool because you're walking through and it's like, wow, Robert E. Lee lived here. But while we were walking through, the guy I was with, he pointed out, he's like, that's the desk that Robert E. Lee was sitting at when he refused Abraham Lincoln's letter to join the Union Army, which is a pretty incredible little piece of history right there. And then I've also been to Ronald Reagan's house in Santa Barbara, California, the Reagan Ranch, which is truly an incredible experience. It's a little bit different
That
from
is, yeah, I've been there.
you've been. Oh my god, it's amazing. It's different than other historical sites because when the Reagan sold it to YAF, because I'm a member of YAF, Young America's Foundation, so we went out there as part of a sort of a retreat. But when they sold it to YAF, they didn't touch a single thing. So there's no ropes in the house. His books are still laying on tables. His soap bottles are still literally in the shower from when he was using them. Their clothes are in the closet. So you're walking through his house and it's all the original furniture. Everything's completely original, untouched. So it feels like he's just out at the grocery store, walking around, could come back any minute. I'm standing in the guy's bedroom and it's like President Reagan was literally like sleeping here and nothing's changed. It's so surreal. But what was sort of that feeling that you have in the Lincoln home? Can you kind of feel his presence in a way?
Definitely. Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, not everything in the Lincoln home is authentic to the Lincoln family, but much of it is. The big thing, though, the one that we tell everyone, is that the handrail that goes up the stairs, that's original, and that people are always interested in that one. Like, wow, this was Abraham Lincoln touched this handrail that I'm touching as I'm going upstairs. So yeah, there was so much about it that I loved. Yeah, being in there alone is definitely this is going to sound a little cheeseball, but it's kind of a spiritual experience. It really is.
No, I 100% believe you.
Yeah, and it was, 'cause as I'm reading about his life, like, well, the front room is where they offered him the presidential nomination to run for president for the Republican Party in this particular room. And in another room is the mirror, where I don't know if you know the story. Supposedly, right before he left for Washington, Lincoln was laying on a couch and he looked at this mirror and he said he saw two images of himself. One was normal and one was very white, ghostly, like he looked like he was dead. And as the story goes, he told his wife Mary, and she said, well, that means you're going to be elected twice, but you won't live to see the end of your second term. So that's an interesting story. That's kind of apocryphal. I believe that he saw the image. I don't believe that he told his wife. Mary never would have handled that kind of news. She emotionally she couldn't have handled that. But that mirror is in that room, and so I've looked in that mirror. It's kind of an amazing thing to think about.
And
There's
that's
just so
the original
much.
mirror.
It is, yeah. I believe it is, yeah. But at Lincoln's home is different though, because when I gave a tour, and the Rangers, we'd have to research and create our own tours. It's not a script; you have to do your own. And so my theme of my tour was, today Abraham Lincoln is a secular godhead. When he lived in that house, he was just a man. He was a middle class guy with a wife and children. He had a cow in the barn he had to milk every day. He had a horse he had to take care of. And he just lived his life there. And so, I would like to think about him being in the front room with his children, sitting there with the fire at night. He's reading a book. The children are playing. Mary's sewing. And you begin to see Lincoln as a man, because he was just a man. I mean, we always hear about his greatness, but he had flaws. When he was president, he made mistakes, which he learned from as a good person does. But so yeah, it was incredible. When I went to the Mary Todd Lincoln home in Lexington, Kentucky, I had a moment like you were talking about. I was working on my book, my biography of Robert Lincoln, and I was just at the part where Robert was just 4 years old, and he and his parents went to Lexington, and they stayed in the Todd family home. And so when you go up the stairs, it goes up and over and then up, and there's a seat by the window. And I think there were some books there. It's been like 20 years since I went there. But in many of the recollections, Lincoln spent most of his time in the library reading books, and he would sit on that windowsill and read them. And I remember that struck me. I'm like, wow, this is right in front of me. This is where he sat and would read books. And it's amazing what strikes you as you're in historic places or doing research in museums or archives.
It truly is incredible, and obviously we're both history buffs, so we can really deeply appreciate this sort of stuff. But I've said it before on this podcast. I really urge people to go to these sort of historical sites of any sort of figure or event that you're interested in, because when you're there, like you said, Lincoln was just a man. It strips away the legend and the larger than life figure that's been created throughout history and the mythology of him, and it strips it all away. And it's like, this was just a man. And if you just rewind time a couple days ago, he was walking around here doing everyday normal tasks, reading books, milking the cow, and it's so incredible just to be there and to visualize that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's why, as you know, history is just endlessly amazing. One thing about, for me, I'm sure many people are the same, is that having worked as a park ranger and stuff, I love the smell of a historic home. There is a smell that smells like history, and I miss that. And then whenever I go into a place like that and I smell that, I just get this wonderful wistfulness of, when I worked at Lincoln's Home or Gettysburg, or, I spent about 2 years at Hildene, Robert Todd Lincoln's home in Manchester, Vermont, which is a wonderful place. I highly recommend. Um, it's just an incredible feeling that you can read a lot of books, but you don't get the same feeling when you're there.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanna linger on Abraham Lincoln a little bit before we get into Mary and Robert. Going back to this mirror image that he saw, I think it says a lot about, you know, who he was as a person, sort of the stuff he suffered with. I think it's pretty well known at this point that he did suffer from severe depression. So I think maybe that was the two versions he saw of himself. But behind closed doors, who was Abraham Lincoln as a man in his personal life?
Yeah, he was, well, first of all, I do not subscribe to the belief that he was severely or clinically depressed. I think he definitely had periods of melancholy, as we all can do. Maybe he did more so than some people, but um, there are various reasons that I don't buy that. The main one, though, is that everyone can and does claim Lincoln for their own, and everybody can see things in him that reflects themselves. But also historians and regular readers and enthusiasts also, they tend to pack him with trials and tribulations that he may not necessarily have suffered, just to make him seem greater. Well, he fought a war and he did this and he did that. Oh, all while suffering from depression, all while dealing with his horrible harpy wife, which is an interpretation I don't agree with. All while suffering from, Marfan's or cancer, or whatever people say. And a lot of people who knew him did that as well after he died. But so Lincoln, back to your original question, he was just a pretty normal guy. I think today, I mean, we've built him so much up in our heads today, but I think today people would probably be disappointed if they met him. Because, again, you can't always tell with photographs, but he was tall and lanky. He never combed his hair. His clothing didn't usually fit correctly. A lot of people, when he was alive, during his life, but especially after becoming president, they just thought he was incredibly uncouth because he would just tell jokes constantly, tell stories and anecdotes constantly. And to him, that was a way to deal with his stress, especially as president. But a lot of people back then thought it was very improper to do those things. And Lincoln was a man's man. He loved hanging out with the guys. He'd riding the Eighth Judicial Circuit. He'd be gone 6 to 9 months of the year, while every lawyer on the circuit would go home whenever they had a break. Lincoln didn't. He stayed out there the whole time. A lot of people think, well, it's because he hated his wife and he didn't want to go home. I disagree. I think he did that because he loved being out there. But also, when you read about Lincoln as a politician, he was brilliant. He could cite off facts and figures that nobody else knew without looking them up. He could tell you, who voted for whom in what precinct, how many votes this person got, what the percentage of voting was, how many people didn't vote. It's incredible. And he learned all these things. He became a great politician by talking to people. And that's what he would do on the circuit. He would just talk all night long to people, not just politicians and lawyers, but to everybody. He was a very democratic guy. And so, he seemed like he'd be a lot of fun to just someone to just hang out and talk with. But he was a politician. I'm sure that that's probably, it seems to me, I bet, we all talk about our passions. I bet he talked about politics constantly.
So you're an independent historian, and it seems that you kind of cut against the grain in terms of the mainstream narrative regarding the Lincoln family. Do you ever get a lot of flack from the historical community for your work?
So, sometimes there are some things I disagree with, and there are some things I don't disagree with. Sometimes there are some interesting things that we as historians disagree with. Most of my colleagues, we understand it's a difference of interpretation. Generally, people don't take it personally, but a lot of things that I have strong opinions on are because I've been studying them for so long, like Robert Lincoln or Mary Lincoln, that most others haven't because they focus on Abraham and they think they understand Mary or Robert from all the peripheral reading that they get. And which is nothing against them. I mean, they're not researching Robert, so why do they care? But, like Robert's reputation today is that he was a horrible person. He hated his mother. He was embarrassed by his father. He could care less about his family. And he was exactly the opposite of that. And, the big thing I deal with is my interpretation of Mary Lincoln. So, my first book was called The Madness of Mary Lincoln. And I write all about her mental health from childhood to death. And I consulted medical experts, and I think she suffered from bipolar disorder. And I found, 14 members of the Todd family who all had some form of mental disease. So it was a family trait. But I also think that she was an incredible woman in many ways, but she had very real flaws. And so I think you can't understand someone unless you understand and accept everything about them. So, especially with Mary today, people are either like, she was crazy and a horrible person that hated her husband, or, Lincoln was a moron and Mary was really the brains behind the throne. Really, she was Hillary Clinton 100 years too soon, which is utter baloney. But there isn't a lot in the middle, and I come down in the middle. So, it's all, we all of our Lincoln historians, we all have our things we focus on. So, the more we know about something, the stronger our opinions are. So, it's all, one thing I love is that, I don't take things personally. It's arguing and discussing these things is really what's exciting about it, because there's so much out there that we don't know. I mean, nobody can know everything about Lincoln. So by discussing, you can maybe learn something you didn't know and maybe change your mind, maybe not.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm a huge believer in discussion. It's sort of the reason I started this podcast, something I'm super grateful for that this podcast has given me. It's given me the opportunity to speak with some brilliant historians like yourself. And really, you can read books and you can listen to videos, but nothing is the same as actual discussion and bouncing ideas off other people and really fleshing out kind of your own ideas and articulating them. And I think that's the most important um goal in terms of an academic journey, an intellectual journey, is discussing, because that's where the most breakthroughs occurs during discussion. But I want to pull on this thread of Lincoln just a little bit longer. You mentioned earlier that people have sort of used Lincoln for their own and their own ideologies. And he's obviously been so mythologized throughout American history. Do you think there's any dangers in creating a myth around characters that sort of bends history and misinterprets history in a way?
Oh, absolutely. I understand revisionist history and where it comes from, but where it has come to today, I, in many cases, not in all cases, in many cases, I abhor it. There are, as a historian, when history is all about rich old white guys, yeah, you're not getting the whole story. So yes, we need books and articles and things about the women and the slaves and the lower class, middle class people, the regular people. We need all that. But when you start doing things like I just mentioned about Mary Lincoln, when feminist revisionism in the 1980s came around, and that's when it started. So Mary Lincoln, she was always Mary Lincoln. Today we call her Mary Todd Lincoln. That was because of feminist revisionist history in the 1980s. They inserted her maiden name, and it has still stuck. But she never went by that. But, people today, a lot of people think she was the brains behind the throne, the power behind the throne. Without her, Lincoln never would have been president. And I completely disagree with that. That's just not, you can't look at the 19th century from a 21st century viewpoint. So, there's that whole thing about Lincoln being gay that's going on right now
Really?
is the most ridiculous thing I've
What's
ever
that
heard.
argument about?
Um,
I haven't heard that.
oh, there was a book 10 or 15 years ago, and actually there's a TV program that just came out, I think, a few months ago. And the whole argument of that basically is taking 19th century facts and figure social mores of what Lincoln did and who he was with and whatnot, and giving it a 21st century spin and calling it gay. So, basic example, when he was on the judicial circuit, he slept with men. Oh my God, that sounds horrible. Oh my God, he must have been gay. So, back on the judicial circuit, there'd be 12 lawyers. There'd be 2 rooms at the end, one bed in each room. So, sometimes if the bed was big enough, they'd sleep 4 to a bed. They go head, toe, head, toe, head, toe. That was the only place to sleep. There's no central heat. That's how you stay warm. I mean, that's that people, back in the day, even in the 1890s, not even in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, men would frequently tell each other in letters they loved each other. They would walk down the street arm in arm. Very manly, typical thing to do. Today, to us, that sounds gay. Back then, that's just what it was. So it's basically this whole argument is just taking it out of context, out of time, and just being ignorant about the facts. But it's interesting when you look at Lincoln as the mythologized person. Um, there definitely can be dangers to that, especially if you try to use him as a precedent for today. Um, I love politics, so I always find it interesting how every politician claims the Lincoln mantle from both parties, and they all say, "Well, Lincoln, if he were alive today, he'd be a Democrat." Like, oh well, if Lincoln were alive today, he'd still be a Republican because he was one. And so, it. I just find it interesting how people always try to claim his mantle. There's so many books about him that are wonderful and hilarious. My favorite has got to be that I ever found because there are books about Lincoln, Lincoln the poet, Lincoln the writer, Lincoln the horse rider, Lincoln the lawyer, Lincoln the whatever. My favorite one. There's one. This is a real book. It is called Lincoln's Doctor's Dog, and it's all about how Lincoln loved animals. Like, who wrote that and who published that? Well, I guess it had an audience of animal lovers. I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think, though? What do you think Lincoln would have thought of today's political landscape?
Oh, so many things.
It is a difficult, loaded
Yeah,
question, and a lot of historians I talk to, they don't like dealing in hypotheticals, but I do like delving into the realm of the unknown.
I do too. I think it's fun. It's all speculation. So, you can't get. I find people. It's humorous to me to get upset about it. You can't get upset about it. We're just speculating. I think. Well, first of all, I think Lincoln or so many politicians up until boy, I don't even know, early 20th century, they would be disgusted, dismayed, and shocked by how little character and statesmanship there is in the United States government today in both parties. Um, as far as Lincoln, there's arguments you could argue that he would be more of a Democrat today because he believed in national policy, often more so. See, he believed that the government should only do what individuals cannot do for themselves, which is pretty typical. That's a Republican philosophical point today, generally. But it depends on how you interpret, what can citizens not do? So Lincoln was in favor of national roads and national transportation as a Whig back in the day. The Democrats opposed it because they said, government doesn't need to get involved in that. That's a local issue. And so again, that's an interpretation. Well, yeah, roads are pretty national
Yeah, he probably would
today.
have loved Eisenhower, who created the
I think
interstate
so. Yeah.
system.
Oh, he would have loved the highway system because he tried to get that past Illinois, a highway system in Illinois when he was in the state legislature, and he never was able to make it work. But yeah, so I think, it's hard to say. I'm sure there's a lot of things about today he would love, things he would hate. He was an incredibly scientific minded, tech savvy guy. So I think he would love where we are technologically today. In the White House, he was fascinated by weapons and inventions and the telegraph and everything. And oh, he would have a cell phone with him all the time. He'd be looking things up on the web. I think he would love that and see how he could use that technology to better Americans and to better humanity. Not just himself.